we're going to start with something that is, a huge risk. We're going to do something together that none of us have ever heard before. I have a story to tell, and I'm going to tell it with the musical accompaniment, but we're going to make up the musical accompaniment as we go along. And so I'm going to start playing the banjo. And then you guys will, as you see some idea of how to play along, we'll play along. And then when the three of you are all playing along, I'll stop playing the banjo and tell the story. And you guys will just keep on playing, and you'll make it up as you go along. Called The Tale of Tales, and it's about the time long, long ago when the world was new and the whole world sat in the middle of a great blue bowl on the back of a humongous turtle. Now, the world was a very different place in those days. For one thing, all the people in the world lived together. They all lived together in one place. In fact, they all lived together in one tree, a gigantic baobab tree on the edge of a huge cliff. They lived in the branches and slept in the branches at night, and they came down in the daytime and, foraged for food and stuff like that. Now, people were also quite different in those days than they are today. For one thing, they had not yet learned how to speak. Oh, they had voices. They could sing. And they could dance when they sang and stuff like that. And they could make warning signals. But they had no words, so they could not speak. And another thing that was different about the people in those days was they all had tails. Oh, some had long tails, some had short tails, some had kinky tails, some had straight tails, some had bushy tails, some had naked tails, and every person had a tail of their own. Like snowflakes. They were all different. Now, there were dragons in those days. But not like the dragons you hear about today. Dragons then, like the people, were very different from the dragons of today. The dragons then, they didn't have these great gossamer wings, and they could not fly. They had little tiny wings to brush the flies off in the summertime. And they were great, big, fat, lumbering creatures that galooped across the countryside, grabbing things and going and eating them and stuff like that. But the dragons also, they were not the fine creatures that you see in mythology today. The dragons then were very, very stupid. In fact, they were so small of brain that a dragon in those days could hardly figure out what to do. If a dragon wanted to do something, what they did is they looked around and saw what most everybody else was doing, and then they did that. Because they just couldn't make up their mind for themselves as to what to do. And another thing is that they were so stupid that they had a great deal of difficulty shifting gears and changing from doing one thing to another. They might get the thought that they want to do something else, but it took them a long, long, long time to actually get around to changing from one thing to another. And this turned out actually to be a very lucky thing for all the people in the world, because it kept them safe from dragons. How, you say? Well, it was like this. Whenever a dragon would approach, all the people in the world would run towards the cliff. And the dragon, seeing everybody running towards the cliff, would run towards the cliff. Now, when the people got to the edge of the cliff, they stopped. But the dragon thought maybe he should stop, but it was too late. It took him much longer than that to figure out what to do, and so the dragon would just keep running right over the edge of the cliff and go falling down, down, boom, down, boom, down, boom, boom, down at the bottom. And then, well, it was a very high cliff, but it also was a very, 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 very long cliff. It would take the dragon about a month or so to work its way all the way most of the dragons, pretty much almost all of the dragons, gave up on the idea of going where the people were because it didn't feel so good afterwards. Except for one dragon. There was one dragon that would not leave the people alone. And that was because they had something of his and he wanted it back. You see, they had stolen that dragon's flame, and they kept it at the foot of their tree like a campfire. And they would come down and gather around it at night, and they would sing and dance around the flame, and eventually they'd go to sleep. And the dragon kept coming back to try and get his flame. So the people always made sure there was at least one person awake in case the dragon came at night looking for his flame. And then if the dragon arrived, that person would make a signal, whoa! And everybody would wake up and they'd all run towards the cliff, and the dragon would run towards the cliff, saying in his head, don't do this, don't do this, don't do this. But he couldn't stop himself. He'd get to the edge of the cliff, he'd try and stop, and he'd just go over. And then a month and a half later, sure enough, he'd show up again, and the whole cycle would repeat. And this went on and on and on. The people felt pretty safe from dragons, from that dragon as well, because they'd worked out that system, and it worked really well. Until one day, or one night I should say, when they had such a wild party, so much singing and dancing that they all fell asleep. Not a single one was left awake to watch for the dragon. And it just so happened that that was the night that the dragon came. And seeing all the people asleep, he tiptoed around the people. And he positioned himself between the people and the cliff. And then he crept up to where the people were. And he reached up with his great long clawed paw, and he was about to reach down and grab that flame and stuff it in his mouth when he coughed. And woke up all the people in the world who looked up, but they couldn't do their usual trick running towards the cliff because the dragon was there. They would be running right into his jaws. They were paralyzed with fear. They didn't know what to do until one little girl, one clever little girl came up with an idea, a very bright idea. She grabbed hold of her tail and she stuck it in her mouth. All the people in the world looked at her. They didn't know why she did that. But she was the only one who seemed to have any kind of idea, so they grabbed hold of their tails and stuck them in their mouth too. Well, the dragon, seeing this, of course, grabbed hold of his tail and stuck it in his mouth. And then the little girl began to chew. Munch, munch, munch. And all the people in the world began to chew. Munch, munch, munch. And of course, the dragon began to chew. Munch, crunch, munch, crunch. Now, those people, they were smart. They were just pretending to chew. That dragon, he was dumb. He was actually chewing. And he started munching away on his tail. Pretty soon he had devoured his whole tail. And he kept right on going because once a dragon starts something, he has a very hard time changing his mind. So he ate his hind legs. And then he ate his body. And then he ate his front legs. And his collarbones and his shoulders and his neck. And finally he devoured his own head and he disappeared. All the people in the world were astonished. Their mouths dropped open in shock. And out of their mouths fell those tails. But somehow, during that time the tails were in their mouths, they were transformed from tails of fur and flesh into tails of words. And the words came out of the mouths of one and went into the ears of another, and out the mouth and in the ears, and out the mouth and in the ears, and on these tales have been told. And since that time, people have taken the whole world to be their dominion. And wherever they've gone, they've taken these tales with them. And even today, around campfires, in small rooms such as this, these stories are still told. For it is by spinning the stories of our ancestors that we know who we are and where we've come from. And that, my friends, is the tale of tales. Thank you. This is the T.E.A. They're tonight's featured performers. They did a wonderful job. I think they deserve an extra.